At 12:01 a.m., my phone lit up like a warning flare. My brother's voice shook so hard I barely recognized it. "What did you do?" he whispered. "Dad just saw the news. He can't breathe. They're calling an ambulance." I stood alone in my apartment, New Year's confetti drifting past my window, the echo of countdown cheers still ringing in the hallways. On my television, a breaking news banner crawled along the bottom of the screen. And there it was, my name. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't shown up. But somehow everything had finally come due. By the time the fireworks started popping outside, I was already sitting on the floor with my back against the couch, wrapped in a sweatshirt that still smelled faintly of laundry soap and cold air. My apartment was clean in that empty, untouched way. No party trays, no champagne bottles sweating onto the counter, no extra coats draped over chairs. Just me, a muted television, and the soft hum of the heater clicking on and off like it was thinking too hard. Earlier that afternoon, I'd stood in front of the mirror adjusting the collar of a simple sweater. Not a uniform, not dress blues, just something normal. I remember pausing, my hands frozen at my neck, because for a second I'd felt ridiculous. Hope will do that to you. It sneaks up quietly, convinces you that this time might be different. The message from my father had come through just after noon. "Don't come tonight. This isn't a military base. We're keeping it relaxed." That was it. "No, I'm sorry. No, maybe another time." Just that one sentence, sharp and dismissive, like he was swatting away a fly. I read it 3 times, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I thought about calling him, about asking what he meant, about reminding him that I'd been deployed on New Year's Eve before, that I knew how to be quiet, how to not take up space. But I didn't. Somewhere deep down I knew exactly what he meant. To him, everything I was, everywhere I'd been, was an inconvenience, a disruption, a reminder that life hadn't unfolded neatly the way he'd planned. So I typed back, "Okay, have a good night." 2 words, neutral, professional, the same tone I'd learned to use in after-action reports and uncomfortable debriefs. Say less, give them nothing to push against. I spent the rest of the day doing small, unnecessary tasks. I wiped down the counter twice. I folded towels that were already folded. I stood at the window watching people haul grocery bags and cases of beer into nearby apartments, laughing, calling out to one another. Someone down the hall played music too loud, the bass thumping through the walls like a second heartbeat. I told myself I was fine. I'd been alone before. Alone was familiar. Still, when the sun went down and the sky turned that bruised winter blue, something in my chest tightened. New Year's Eve had always mattered to my father. He believed in clean slates, in hard resets, in the idea that if you toasted at midnight with the right people, the year would somehow fall into line. Those right people just never seemed to include me. I ordered takeout from the Thai place on the corner, the one with the faded menu taped to the window, and the delivery guy who never smiled. The food went cold on the table while I sat on the couch flipping channels without actually watching anything. Every network was running the same thing, smiling hosts, glittering dresses, crowds packed shoulder to shoulder like the world wasn't full of fractures. At 10 minutes to midnight, I muted the TV. The silence was loud. It pressed in around me, filling the space where laughter should have been, where my brother's sarcastic comments usually landed, where my father's voice would rise just a little too high after his second drink. I thought about all the other holidays I'd missed. Thanksgiving spent eating reheated turkey in a mess hall. Birthdays marked by grainy video calls and promises to celebrate when you get back. I'd told myself it was the price of service, that sacrifice was part of the deal. I believed it too, mostly. What I hadn't expected was to be punished for it. When the countdown started on screen 10:98, I didn't join in. I watched the numbers silently, my arms wrapped around my knees. At 0, the building erupted. Cheers, whistles, the muffled boom of fireworks cracking open the sky. I didn't move. The clock on my microwave flipped to 12:01. That was when my phone rang. I knew it was my brother before I even looked. He never called unless something was wrong. His name flashed across the screen, and for a second I considered letting it go to voicemail. I was tired. Tired of being the responsible one, the steady one, the one who answered. I picked up anyway. He said, using the nickname from when we were kids. His breath came fast, uneven. "What did you do?" I'm home, I said, confused. I didn't do anything. You had to do something, he insisted. Dad just saw the news. He went white. Like actually white. He started clutching his chest. Linda's freaking out. They're calling 911. I stood up slowly, my bare feet cold against the floor. What news? There was a pause on the line, the sound of people shouting in the background, a TV turned up too loud. Your name, he said. It's on the TV. They're saying it like it matters. My heart began to pound, each beat loud in my ears. I walked toward my television, unmuting it with shaking fingers. A red banner scrolled along the bottom of the screen. Breaking news. And there it was, my last name, clear as day. For a long moment, I couldn't hear anything else. My brother kept talking, his words blurring together, but all I could focus on was that crawl of white letters moving steadily across the screen, unstoppable. I didn't mean for him to find out like this, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. What does that mean? My brother demanded. What didn't you mean? I watched the screen, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. I looked older than I felt. Tired, grounded in a way that came from years of being told to stand still under pressure. It means, I said, choosing my words carefully, that tonight was never about a party. He swore under his breath, you need to come here right now. I thought about my father's text, about his words. This isn't a military base. I looked around my apartment, quiet, orderly mine. No, I said, and I meant it, I'm not coming. On the screen, the anchor kept talking, explaining, contextualizing, laying out facts that had been signed and sealed weeks ago. Facts that didn't care about feelings or traditions or who'd been invited to dinner. My brother went silent. Outside, another round of fireworks lit up the sky. And for the first time that night, I felt steady. Not triumphant, not cruel, just steady, like I'd finally stopped bracing for impact. Whatever was happening now had been set in motion long before midnight. My brother stayed on the line, his breathing uneven, like he was afraid if he stopped talking, everything would fall apart. I set the phone on speaker and turned the volume down on the television just enough to hear both. The anchor's voice was calm, polished, the kind of tone that made even life-changing news sound reasonable. Authorities confirmed just after midnight, she said, that a previously sealed federal decision has officially gone into effect as of January 1st. My brother cursed softly. They're saying your name again, he whispered. Dad keeps asking what it means. He keeps saying this can't be right. I closed my eyes for a second and leaned against the counter. The cold surface grounded me. I had known this moment would come. I just hadn't expected it to arrive dressed in confetti and sirens. Is he okay? I asked. He's sitting down now, my brother said. But he's not listening to anyone. He keeps yelling at the TV like it can hear him. That sounded like my father. He'd always believed that if he spoke loudly enough, the world would correct itself. On the screen, a graphic appeared beside the anchor dates documents, a timeline laid out cleanly, unemotionally. This wasn't gossip. It wasn't opinion. It was procedure, policy. The kind of thing that didn't bend just because someone was uncomfortable. I thought back to the look on my father's face the last time I'd seen him truly angry. It had been years ago when I'd told him I was extending my service instead of coming home for good. He'd slammed his hand on the table and said, "You're choosing that life over this family." I'd wanted to tell him that life had chosen me first, that the uniform hadn't replaced my family, it had saved me when my family didn't know what to do with me anymore. But I hadn't said it. I'd swallowed the words like I always did. Dad says you embarrassed him, my brother said suddenly. He says you made him look like a fool in front of everyone. I let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. I wasn't even there. That's not how he sees it, my brother replied. Linda's crying. People are whispering. Someone from church recognized your name. I pictured the scene without trying, the living room packed with people holding plastic cups, the TV blaring in the background, my father standing too close to the screen, like proximity might change the facts. I imagined the moment of recognition, the shift in the room's energy. The realization that the daughter he'd dismissed, the one he'd told not to come, had somehow stepped into the spotlight without raising her voice. What exactly are they saying? My brother asked. No one will explain it to me. They just keep saying it's official. It is, I said. It became official at midnight. He went quiet. I could hear him thinking, trying to fit this into the version of the world he understood. My brother had always lived closer to my father's gravity. He'd absorbed the rules without questioning them, learned when to push and when to duck. This was new territory for both of us. "You planned this," he said finally, not accusing, just stating it like a fact. "I prepared," I corrected. "There's a difference." The anchor moved on to context, explaining how the decision had been months in the making, how it had passed every review. My name appeared again, paired with words like authority and jurisdiction, words my father respected when they came from other men. "Dad keeps asking why you didn't tell him," my brother said. I thought about that. About all the times I had told my father things that mattered, about deployments, about injuries, about choices I'd made for my own future. How often those conversations had ended with him shaking his head and saying I was being difficult. "Because he would have tried to stop it," I said. "Or talk me out of it. Or take credit for it." "That's not fair," my brother muttered automatically. "Isn't it?" I asked gently. He didn't answer. The TV cut to footage from earlier that evening, crowds, cheering, lights, flashing a voiceover describing the new year as a chance for renewal. The irony wasn't lost on me. Somewhere in my father's house, surrounded by people and noise, everything he believed to be solid was cracking. And here I was alone in my apartment, feeling strangely balanced. "Are you going to come here?" my brother asked again, his voice quieter now. "They're asking for you." I imagined walking into that house the way conversations would stop mid-sentence, the way eyes would follow me, measuring. I imagined my father's anger, his fear, his need to regain control. I imagined how small I'd feel standing in that doorway. "No," I said, "not tonight." There was a long pause. When my brother spoke again, his voice had changed. "He told everyone you didn't come because you were busy, that you couldn't unplug." I swallowed. "He told me not to come." "I know," my brother said softly. "I heard him." The anchor's segment ended, replaced by speculation and panel discussions. People who had never met me debated implications, praised restraint, questioned motives. I muted the TV again. I didn't need commentary. The facts were enough. "I need to go," my brother said suddenly. "The paramedics are here." "Call me when you know more," I said. He hesitated. Whatever this is, it's bigger than he thought." "I know," I replied. The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, the quiet settling back into place. Outside, the fireworks were slowing bursts, becoming sporadic as people drifted home. The new year had arrived, whether anyone was ready or not. I thought about the paperwork I'd signed months earlier, the meetings that had taken place behind closed doors, the careful consideration I'd given to every consequence. None of it had been impulsive. None of it had been personal. It had simply been necessary. On the coffee table, my phone buzzed with incoming messages, numbers I didn't recognize, names I hadn't heard in years. I ignored them. Tonight wasn't for explanations. I walked to the window and watched the last of the smoke fade into the cold sky. Somewhere across town, my father was learning that the world didn't pause just because he disapproved. And for the first time, that knowledge didn't scare me. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the couch with the lights off, listening to the city settle into the first quiet hours of the year. Sirens passed somewhere in the distance, then faded. The heater clicked on and off. My phone stayed face down on the table, vibrating every few minutes like it was trying to remind me of something I already knew. When morning came, it brought a thin gray light and a heaviness behind my eyes. I made coffee and didn't drink it. I stood at the window and watched a plow scrape the street, clean sparks flashing every time the blade caught the curb. It was the kind of practical, unglamorous work that still felt honest. Clear the road, move forward. That had always been my approach. Do the work, don't make a scene, keep moving. Growing up, I learned early how to make myself smaller. After my mother died, the house changed in ways no one talked about. My father filled the space with rules and expectations, with sharp opinions about how things should be done and who should do them. My brother fit easily into that structure. He stayed, he listened, he learned which jokes landed and which topics to avoid. I didn't. I asked questions. I pushed back. I wanted to leave our small town and see what else existed beyond it. When I enlisted, my father told people I was going through a phase. When I re-enlisted, he stopped using my rank when he introduced me, as if saying it out loud might invite disagreement. "Don't bring that military stuff into the house," he'd say whenever I corrected someone or spoke too directly. "This isn't a base." Over time, the phrase became shorthand for everything he disliked about me: my posture, my boundaries, my refusal to soften my voice to make others comfortable. Still, I sent money home when things were tight. I covered bills without being asked. I showed up when my brother needed help, when my father needed a favor, when the family needed someone reliable. I did it quietly without keeping score because that's what I thought loyalty looked like. But loyalty, I learned, was a one-way street in our family. The decision that changed everything didn't come from anger. It came from exhaustion. Months earlier, I'd been sitting in a nondescript conference room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, listening as a panel walked through a proposal that had been circulating for some time. It was complex, layered, and thoroughly reviewed. My role wasn't dramatic. I wasn't there to make speeches or issue ultimatums. I was there because I had the authority, the experience, and the legal standing to sign off. I remember asking questions. I remember reading every line twice. I remember thinking about who would be affected not just on paper but in real life. I thought about my father only in the abstract, as someone who believed certain things were permanent simply because they'd always been that way. When I signed, I did it knowing exactly when it would take effect. January 1st, midnight, a clean line between before and after. I didn't tell my family because for once the decision wasn't theirs to influence. I didn't owe them a warning. I didn't owe them reassurance. I owed myself clarity. That morning, as the news replayed highlights from the night before, my phone finally rang again. This time it was my father. I stared at his name on the screen for a long moment before answering. "What did you do?" he demanded, skipping any pretense. His voice was hoarse, strained, like he'd been shouting or crying or both. "I did my job," I said calmly. "You blindsided me," he snapped. "You humiliated me. People were asking questions I couldn't answer." I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. "You could have answered them by telling the truth." "What truth?" he shot back. "That my own daughter doesn't respect me enough to talk things through." I felt the familiar pull to apologize, to smooth things over, to say something that would ease his discomfort. The reflex was strong. Years of practice will do that to you. Instead, I said, "You told me not to come last night." "That has nothing to do with this," he said quickly. "It has everything to do with this," I replied. "You didn't want me there. You didn't want what I represent in your house. But you were fine benefiting from it." Silence stretched across the line. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted. "You're reading too much into things." I almost smiled. That was his favorite defense. If he minimized long enough, problems usually went away. "I'm not," I said. "I just stopped pretending." He exhaled sharply. "You think because you wear a uniform and sign papers you get to decide how this family operates." "No," I said. "I think because I'm an adult I get to decide how my life operates." He scoffed. "This isn't how families handle disagreements." I thought about all the times I'd handled disagreements by swallowing them. All the holidays I'd spent explaining my absence to relatives who didn't ask why I was gone, only why I wasn't home. All the checks I'd written quietly hoping they'd buy a little goodwill. "This wasn't a disagreement," I said. "It was a boundary." Another pause. I could hear him breathing, uneven and frustrated. "You always do this," he muttered. "You make things harder than they need to be." "No," I said, my voice steady. "I make them clear." He hung up without another word. I set the phone down and felt the weight of the moment settle into my bones. Not relief, not guilt, just a deep, unshakable certainty. Outside, the street was clean now, the snow pushed aside into neat, manageable piles. The year had begun, whether anyone liked it or not. So had the consequences of every choice that came before it. I didn't know how my family would respond next. I didn't know how long the fallout would last. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I hadn't done anything wrong. I had simply stopped asking for permission to exist. By mid-morning, the story had grown legs. I turned the television back on out of habit more than curiosity, and there it was again, my name no longer a passing mention, now anchored to analysis, expert commentary, and scrolling headlines. The anchor spoke slowly, deliberately, as if aware that what she was explaining would land hardest on people who believed certain structures were untouchable. "This decision," she said, "has been legally finalized for months, but its activation date, January 1st, means its effects are now immediate. Immediate, that word echoed in my head. I sat at the small kitchen table with my coffee finally cooling in my hands, listening as legal analysts broke down implications in plain language. No drama, no speculation, just cause and effect. What changed? Who held authority now? Who no longer did? My phone buzzed again. A text from my brother. "They're still talking about it. Dad keeps saying they must be wrong." I typed back, "They're not." A minute passed before 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "People here are asking if you planned this." I looked around my apartment, the framed certificates on the wall, the neatly stacked folders in the corner, the quiet order of a life built deliberately. Planned. The word carried weight, but not the accusation he probably meant. "I prepared," I replied again. "Planning implies malice." Another buzz. This time a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring. Then another. Then a third. I turned the phone face down and focused on the screen instead. A graphic appeared showing a timeline starting years back, outlining decisions and approvals, each one checked and verified. Somewhere in that timeline was my signature, one among many, but still visible. Still binding. I imagined my father watching this unfold in real time, surrounded by people who were now suddenly quiet. Men he'd shaken hands with. Neighbors who'd complimented his lawn. Church friends who thought they knew his family. All of them learning at once that the daughter he'd dismissed wasn't a footnote in this story. She was the hinge. When the doorbell rang, I jumped despite myself. No one ever came by unannounced. I checked the peephole out of habit, half expecting to see a reporter or a concerned neighbor. Instead, it was just the delivery guy from the Thai place holding a paper bag. "I think this is yours," he said when I opened the door, pointing at the receipt. "You didn't touch it last night." I smiled faintly and took the bag. "Thanks." As soon as the door closed, the quiet rushed back in. I set the food on the counter and leaned against it, grounding myself again. Even in moments like this, I needed small, ordinary anchors. The TV cut to a split screen. On one side, footage of a press briefing. On the other, a still image of my father's neighborhood, an establishing shot someone had pulled from public records. It wasn't invasive, but it was enough. Enough to make the point that private lives don't stay private when they intersect with public consequence. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my aunt. "Your father is beside himself," she wrote. "Why would you do this to him?" I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. "I didn't do anything to him," I replied. "I did something for myself." The response came almost immediately. "Family doesn't work like that." I didn't answer. The anchor's voice softened as she transitioned to a broader discussion, how moments like this challenge long-held assumptions, how authority is often inherited without question until it isn't. She spoke about generational shifts, about accountability. I wondered if my father was hearing any of it, or if he was stuck on the one detail he couldn't swallow, that his control had limits. Another call came in, this one I recognized, Linda. I hesitated, then answered. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice thin, stretched tight with emotion. I could hear muffled sounds in the background, voices, movement, the aftermath of a party that had ended badly. "I'm calm," I said. "There's a difference." She sniffed. He didn't see this coming. "I know," I replied. "He feels betrayed." I closed my eyes. So did I, for a long time. Silence filled the space between us. Linda had always hovered on the edge of our family dynamics, smoothing things over, avoiding direct conflict. I didn't blame her for that. It was survival. "People are asking what this means," she said finally. "They're asking if things will change." "They already have," I answered. The call ended shortly after that, unresolved. I didn't expect anything else. By early afternoon, the story had run its course. News cycles move fast. There was always something newer, louder waiting in the wings. But the damage, or the correction, depending on how you saw it, had been done. I turned the TV off and stood in the quiet, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic. Outside, the world was getting on with its day. Inside, I felt something settle into place. For years, my family had spoken about me in terms of absence, who I wasn't there to be, what I'd missed, how inconvenient my choices were. Today, they were being forced to reckon with who I actually was. Not the version they'd edited to fit their comfort, not the one they invited only when it suited them. The real one. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the missed calls and messages without opening them. There would be time for explanations later, or there wouldn't. Either way, I wasn't obligated to rush. I looked out the window at the pale winter sky and felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest, not pride, not vengeance, but recognition. For the first time, my name carried weight in a room I wasn't even standing in. And no one could pretend anymore that I didn't belong. The call came just after sunset. I knew it was my father before I answered. Not because of the name on the screen, I hadn't saved his number in months, but because of the weight in my chest the moment the phone started ringing. Some instincts don't fade. They just wait. I let it ring 3 times before picking up. "What did you think would happen?" he said, skipping hello. His voice was rough, scraped raw by anger and panic. "You think you can just do this and walk away?" "I didn't walk away," I replied evenly. "You told me not to come." "That's not the point," he snapped. "You don't air family business in public." I leaned back against the couch and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't family business. It was legal business. You just happened to be affected by it. A sharp laugh burst from him, humorless. "Don't play word games with me. You know exactly what this looks like." "I know exactly what it is," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." He took a breath, long and shaky. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted, sliding into something familiar. Reasonable, paternal. The voice he used when he wanted compliance. "You could have talked to me first," he said. "We could have handled this quietly, like a family." I pictured all the times I'd tried to do exactly that. The conversations cut short, the concerns dismissed, the moments when my presence had been tolerated but never welcomed. "I tried talking," I said, "for years. You didn't hear me." "That's not true," he insisted. "You always exaggerate." I closed my eyes. "You told me my life didn't belong in your house." He hesitated. "Just for a second. I said this wasn't a military base." "That's what I am," I replied. "You didn't want me there because you don't know how to sit with that." His breath hitched, then turned sharp. "You think wearing a uniform makes you better than us?" "No," I said quietly. "I think it taught me what boundaries look like." He went silent. When he spoke again, the anger was back raw and unfiltered. "You embarrassed me. In front of everyone. Do you have any idea what people are saying?" "Yes," I answered. "They're saying the truth." "You think the truth matters more than family," he shot back. I paused. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because this was the question he'd been asking me my entire life, whether he realized it or not. "I think family without respect isn't family," I said. "It's obligation." His voice rose. "So that's it. You just draw a line and decide we're on the wrong side of it." "I didn't decide that," I replied. "Your actions did." He scoffed. "You always were difficult." A small smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "You always said that when I stopped agreeing with you." There was a thud on the other end of the line, like he'd sat down hard. For a moment, all I could hear was his breathing. "You could fix this," he said finally. "You could make this go away." I straightened. "How?" "You know how," he replied. "Say it was a misunderstanding. Walk it back. Do something." I thought about the paperwork, the months of review, the legal safeguards built precisely so no one could walk it back on a whim. I thought about the younger version of myself standing in his kitchen trying to explain why leaving felt necessary. "I'm not fixing something that wasn't broken," I said. "I'm not undoing a decision just because it makes you uncomfortable." His voice cracked. "I'm your father." "Yes," I said. "And I'm your daughter, not your asset, not your extension." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on both of us. "I gave everything to this family," he said, quieter now. "So did I replied. "The difference is I don't expect control in return." He swallowed audibly. "This isn't how I raised you." I thought about my mother then, her quiet strength, the way she'd squeezed my hand. Whenever my father's temper flared, the look she'd given me the day I left for training. Pride, fear, understanding. "You raised me to stand on my own," I said. "You just didn't think I'd stand up to you." A sound escaped him then, somewhere between a sigh and a groan. "You don't know how hard this is for me." "I do," I said gently. "I just don't let it decide everything anymore." Another pause, longer this time. "So what now?" he asked, the fight draining from his voice. "Now," I said, "we take some space. We stop pretending nothing happened. We learn how to talk without trying to win." And if I can't, he asked. Then we don't talk, I answered. Not until you can. The words hung between us, stark and unyielding. You'd really do that, he murmured. I already am, I said. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He just let out a long breath, the sound of someone finally realizing they couldn't push any harder. This isn't over, he said weakly. No, I agreed, but it's different now. When the call ended, I set the phone down carefully as if it might break. My hands were steady. My chest felt tight but not crushed. Outside, the night had deepened, the city lights flickering on one by one. I stood at the window and watched people move through their routines, unaware of the quiet shift that had just taken place inside me. For the first time, I hadn't chosen peace at my own expense. I had chosen myself. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, a combination that always made my shoulders tense. I signed in at the front desk with the same calm efficiency I used everywhere else, even though my pulse was too fast and my palms felt dry. The nurse glanced at my ID, then at me, and nodded toward the hallway. He's stable, she said. Panic-induced respiratory distress. We've got him on oxygen. Family's already inside. Family. The word landed heavier than it should have. I walked down the corridor, slowly listening to the soft beep of monitors behind closed doors, the shuffle of rubber soles against polished floors. This place was designed for vulnerability. No titles, no authority, just bodies that needed care. My brother was the first person I saw when I stepped into the room. He was standing by the window, arms folded tight across his chest, staring out at the parking lot like he might bolt. He looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders rounded, his jaw clenched. Hey, I said quietly. He turned, eyes red-rimmed. Hey. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving. The machines hummed steadily behind us. On the bed, my father lay propped up on pillows, a clear tube running beneath his nose. His eyes were open, unfocused at first, then sharp as they landed on me. You came, he said, disbelief threading through his voice. I said I would, I replied, when things settled. Linda sat in the corner, hands wrapped around a paper cup. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable, tired, wary, relieved all at once. No one spoke for a few seconds. The silence wasn't hostile, it was careful. My father broke it first. You didn't have to, he said, his voice rough. I know, I answered. I wanted to. He looked away toward the wall like the effort of meeting my eyes was too much. The doctor said I'll be fine, he muttered. Just need to calm down. I nodded. That sounds right. My brother let out a short, humorless breath. They told him to stop watching the news. That would help, I said. For a moment I thought that might be it, that we'd all circle around the obvious, avoid the real conversation, and eventually disperse. That was our pattern. But something in the room felt different. Less charged, less performative. My father shifted uncomfortably. They said it was all legal, he said, not looking at me. Everything you did. Yes, I replied. He swallowed. I didn't know. I know, I said again. This time it wasn't an accusation. My brother rubbed his hands together nervously. I didn't know either, he admitted. About any of it. I turned to him. You didn't ask. He flinched, then nodded. That's fair. The monitor beeped steadily, indifferent to our reckoning. Linda stood and moved closer to the bed, resting a hand lightly on my father's arm. He didn't pull away. I think, she said softly, we all made some assumptions. My father let out a shaky breath. I thought I understood how things worked. I stepped closer to the bed, stopping at a respectful distance. You understood how they worked when I stayed quiet. He winced. You think I wanted to hurt you? I considered the question carefully. No, I said. I think you didn't think about me at all. That landed harder than anger ever could. His mouth opened, then closed again. His eyes shone, and for the first time I couldn't tell if the moisture there was from fear or regret. I didn't know how to relate to you, he admitted. After you left, after everything changed. I didn't stop being your daughter, I replied. I just became someone you couldn't control. My brother exhaled slowly. Dad, he said, you promised me things. You told me stuff would work out. My father turned his head toward him. I was trying to help you. You were trying to protect me, my brother corrected. There's a difference. Linda's hand tightened slightly on my father's arm. We all leaned on you, she said to me, more than we should have. I met her gaze. I let you. That was the truth of it. Accountability didn't live in one direction. The room grew quiet again, but this time it felt like a pause, not an avoidance. My father shifted, wincing slightly. "I can't undo what's been done," he said. "I see that now." "I'm not asking you to," I replied. He looked at me, then really looked as if seeing the lines time and experience had carved into my face. "What do you want?" The question surprised me. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because he'd never asked it before. "I want honesty," I said. "I want respect, and I want you to stop speaking about me like I'm a problem to be managed." He nodded slowly. "I don't know if I'll get it right." "I don't need perfect," I replied. "I need effort." My brother stepped closer, his voice low. "And me." I turned to him. "I want you to stand on your own. I'll support you, but I won't carry you." He swallowed hard, then nodded. "I can try." That was enough, for now. The nurse appeared at the door, clipboard in hand. "We're going to have to ask everyone to step out for a bit," she said gently. "He needs rest." We complied without argument. In the hallway, my brother leaned against the wall and dragged a hand down his face. "I didn't realize how much I depended on you," he said quietly. "I didn't realize how much it cost me," I replied. He gave a small, sad smile. "We're both learning, I guess." Linda lingered near the door. "Thank you for coming," she said. "For not escalating things." I thought about that, about all the ways this could have gone differently. "I didn't come to win," I said. "I came to be seen." Outside, the cold air bit at my cheeks as I stepped into the parking lot. The sky was clear stars, sharp against the dark. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the tension in my body finally begin to loosen. The consequences were still unfolding. Nothing had been neatly resolved, but something important had shifted. For the first time, my family was reacting to me, not the version of me they'd created. And that I realized was a kind of beginning. Spring arrived quietly, the way real change often does. Not with announcements or apologies shouted across a room, but with small, ordinary adjustments that only become obvious when you stop and look back. The snow melted into narrow rivers along the sidewalks. Buds appeared on trees I hadn't noticed before. The city shook off winter and kept moving indifferent to my family's reckoning. So did I. The weeks after the hospital visit were careful ones. My father didn't call every day. When he did, he spoke slower, like he was measuring his words before letting them go. Sometimes the calls were awkward, filled with long pauses and weather updates. Sometimes they were better actual conversations, not interrogations or lectures. We were learning a new language with each other, one that didn't rely on guilt or authority. My brother changed too. Not overnight, not dramatically, but he started asking questions instead of waiting for instructions. He talked about finding work that didn't depend on someone else smoothing the way. He failed at a few things and didn't immediately look to me to fix them. That part was hard for both of us. Growth usually is. As for me, I stopped bracing. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd spent anticipating conflict until there wasn't any to anticipate. My shoulders relaxed. I slept through the night. I started doing things just because I wanted to, long walks after work, cooking meals that took time, leaving my phone in another room without anxiety. One afternoon months later, my father asked if he could come by. "Just to talk," he said, "if that's okay." I thought about it, really thought instead of answering automatically. Then I said yes. He arrived without ceremony, hands, empty posture, uncertain. We sat at my small kitchen table, sunlight streaming in through the window. He looked around, taking in the space, the quiet order of it. "You built a good life," he said finally. I nodded. I did. He cleared his throat. "I didn't always make that easy." "No," I agreed, "you didn't." He didn't argue. That alone felt like progress. We talked about my mother's stories we hadn't shared in years. We talked about the past without rewriting it, without pretending it hadn't hurt. When he left, there was no dramatic resolution, no promises carved in stone. Just an understanding that things would be different now because they had to be. That night, I stood by the window again, watching the city lights flicker on as evening settled in. It wasn't New Year's Eve. There were no fireworks, no countdowns, just an ordinary night. And yet it felt more like a beginning than that night ever had. I thought back to the moment my father had told me not to come. This isn't a military base. At the time, it had felt like rejection, like erasure. Now it felt like a marker. The last time I'd accepted someone else defining where I belonged. Belonging, I learned, isn't about being invited. It's about being respected once you arrive. If you're listening to this, and something in it feels familiar, if you've ever been told to make yourself smaller for the comfort of others, if you've ever been praised for your strength while being punished for using it, I want you to know this. You're allowed to draw a line. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to choose peace even when it disappoints people who benefited from your silence. Setting boundaries doesn't make you cold, it makes you honest. And honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is what real connection is built on. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. We're sharing stories like this every day, stories about resilience, boundaries, and finding your footing when the ground shifts beneath you, so consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Let's keep this journey going together.